Dr. Shabir Ally, welcome to Let the Quran Speak.
It's my pleasure to be on.
Islamophobes often make the claim that Muslims are immoral. And I think that's a very problematic claim because, immoral means that you can treat the person without respect. And immoral is also there's a very close or little distinction between immoral and inhuman, right? So when someone is not human, you can, treat them as an object. So it's a problematic statement to be made. What are your thoughts on this comment that they make, or this argument that they make that Muslims are immoral or barbaric? Sometimes they use that term.
Yeah, well, Muslims are taught in our sacred tradition to be some of the most moral people you can find. Morals and ethics are stressed in the Quran throughout. The Quran stresses that Muslims have a responsibility to God and a responsibility to all of God's creatures. In our tradition, we're taught that we have a responsibility towards our spouses, our parents, our children, our relatives in general, to our neighbors, even to our traveling companion, even to strangers that we may meet. Ibn Sabil, somebody who might be traveling and they come upon you and they need something, we have a responsibility to give them from our charitable funds. We have a responsibility to animals. We cannot overuse animals. We need to feed them well and protect them from harm. We have a responsibility to the environment. We are taught that everything around us worships God in a way that we do not understand. So we are taught to protect the creatures of God who are worshippers of God. So a hadith in this respect says that if the day of judgment is upon you and you have a seedling ready to plant it, go ahead and plant it before the day of judgment, because that's a good deed. We are taught that if the tree grows and birds eat from it, people eat from the fruit, then you get reward for all of that, and people just stop to take shade under the tree, or animals stop to take shade under the tree, then too you will get a reward for that. So our good deeds are seen as deeds that are of benefit to all and sundry, even to the animals and to the environment around us.
So what you're saying is that there's a very comprehensive moral code for every aspect of our behavior and dealings with other people, and not just other people, but also the environment.
Exactly. Climate change and the care for the environment are topics that are being discussed widely nowadays. It is interesting in this respect to see that the teachings of Islam are that we should conserve and not waste. The Quran says those who waste are brothers of the devils. And we are taught that even when we're making ablutions for our prayer, which to us is a sacred duty, and we're cleansing ourselves to get ready for prayer, even then we're taught that if you're sitting in front of a running river, still you only use that much water which is necessary for your ablutions, which means that we are being taught, even in this very symbolic act, to not waste water and to conserve the rest of God's provisions, because everything that God has provided for us, everything that we enjoy, these are regarded as ni'mah or bounty of God, and we are to be thankful to God for His bounties, and one of the ways of being thankful is to not misuse or overuse or abuse the bounties that God has given us.
Mm-hmm. How similar or different are we from other Judeo-Christian religions?
The similarities are very great. We share a common heritage of major prophets like Abraham, Moses, and Jesus.
So I ask this question because sometimes Islamophobes will come and say, Islam is completely different from these other religions in terms of its morality.
Yes, this is how they try to set the minds of the American public against Islam, by saying, okay, there are two religions that we know very well and
these
we
are
love.
ethical, moral religions, good
and this
Islam,
other one, this is very different.
Yeah.
But in fact, those who study Islam academically will realize that it sits firmly within the Judeo-Christian tradition. It calls itself a revision and a new revelation from God to correct and to further enhance the previous teachings. But whatever is good in the previous teachings, these are retained and even enhanced in the religion of Islam and in the Quranic revelation in particular. Well, let's look at some of the stories that are mentioned about the great prophets of the past in terms of the question of peace and violence. Jesus, on whom be peace, is not shown in the Quran to have committed any act of violence. And in fact, the Quran speaks of him as a peaceful person. So he is made to say in the Quran, وَالسَّلَامُ عَلَيَّ يَوْمَ وَلِدْتُ وَيَوْمَ أَمُوتُ وَيَوْمَ أُبْعَثُ حَيًّا. Peace be upon me the day I was born, the day I shall die, and the day that I shall be raised alive. So it's all about peace. So when we look at the story of Abraham in the Quran, there's nothing about violence. A story about Moses, again, nothing about him committing acts of violence, the kinds of acts which are known about him from other stories elsewhere. So the Quran sees itself as a revision of the previous traditions, where from the Quranic point of view, some discrepancies entered the previous narratives because of the errors that normally are characteristic of human efforts to collect and compose and retain any narrative of ancient history. So by placing the prophets as heroes and important moral guides for us, the Quran is guiding Muslims towards a higher level of ethical responsibility and moral code.
Mm-hmm. Now, we often think of the Ten Commandments as something in the Bible, but of course, Islam also has its own version of the Ten Commandments.
Yes, absolutely. In the 6th chapter of the Quran and the 17th chapter of the Quran, we have stipulations, regulations, do's and don'ts, which are very similar to what is found in the Ten Commandments. So whereas in the Ten Commandments we have that you should have only one God, we have that in these codes, that you should not worship any idols, we have that too, that you should honor your parents. The Quran is even more emphatic about honoring your parents and about mothers in particular. The Quran is also against murder, adultery, stealing, bearing false witnesses, coveting your neighbor's belongings or things that are dear to them. All of these are stipulations in the Islamic faith as well, and in the Quran itself, which is the very grounding and basis of the Islamic faith.
Mm-hmm. I guess sometimes what Islamophobes are trying to get at is the fact that, Jews and Christians perhaps don't necessarily follow their scriptures in the same way that Muslims do. So some of the more problematic aspects of their scriptures is not reflected in their action, whereas for Muslims, it might be reflected in their action.
So here's where Muslims have some responsibility to represent themselves and their scriptures as being applicable to our modern time and situation. There are some aspects of the scripture which speak to a bygone era and the nature of life and society at the time. And Muslims sometimes have the false idea that they can just simply take the scriptures as they are, take them literally, and apply them in a modern context without any consideration for how the context has changed. And we know that even in the workplace situation, if your boss tells you to do something but the context changes, you know that you have to do something different to just simply capture the original spirit of what your boss has instructed you to do. Otherwise, if you keep doing the same thing, that specifically exactly the way the boss told you to do it, you might actually be thwarting the safety of your company or the prosperity of your company. A boss will come back and say, well, wait a minute, I know I told you that, but when I said that to a person who has brains, and you should know that if the circumstances change, you have to do something different to capture the original spirit. Well, in a similar way, God, speaking to us in the Quran, spoke to us 1400 years ago when the situation was very different from our present one. And to apply the original teachings means that we have to understand the spirit of those teachings and see how the spirit would apply in our present time. Otherwise, if you just do the same thing as you have done before, you might be thwarting God's original intention. And we shouldn't expect that God will be happy with us just because we did exactly the thing he said.
And many Muslims do. Like many Muslims do, many scholars do try to interpret the texts in light of the situation or the time in which they live.
Yes, and they think that by doing so they're being faithful. But you know, we know that I mean, if we're interacting with children, sometimes children come to an age where they just take things literally the way you said it, and they say, "Well, Mom, you told me to do that, so they did exactly." And sometimes we get the impression that people are doing exactly what we said in order to make mockery of what we said. Because it's clear that if they do it exactly the way we said it, it's going to be ridiculous. And in our everyday speech, if you tell somebody take a chair, you don't mean exactly like take the chair and own it. You
But
mean
I
have a seat,
guess
right?
what I was trying to say earlier is that I see that Muslim scholars are doing that. Like they're not trying to copy, you know, word for word, but they're trying to interpret the scriptures in light of the current circumstance.
Yes, yes. Of course, much of that is inevitable, and almost all scholars do
Yeah, and
that.
sometimes they don't do a very good job of it, but you know, in other situations they do, right?
Yes, yes. So first I misinterpreted what you were
Yes,
saying, and I thought that you meant that some scholars are failing to or refusing to.
There are those,
Yes.
but there are also.
So we have a spectrum. Some are insisting on taking this literally, but even those who do, they find themselves inevitably making compromises here or there and taking a metaphorical meaning instead of a literal, because you can't take everything literally. It's impossible. If you take things literally, the Quran says to the non-believers, "I'malu ma shi'tum," do whatever you want. But of course, that's not a Quranic teaching that people should do whatever they want. It's quite the opposite. You should do what God tells you. But how could the Quran say to them, do whatever you want? This is the label of despair over them. It's like saying, okay, I'm done with you. Yeah, you know, nothing good that I say to you will make any difference now. So just do whatever you want, and of course you're going to face the consequences. But if somebody just takes that snippet out of the Quran and runs with it and says, "Hey, the Quran says I can do whatever I want," so then they're taking the opposite meaning of the Quran, though they're going by the literal text. And this is just one example. We can give so many to show that you cannot always take the Quran literally, and by taking the Quran literally all of the time, you might actually be making a mockery of the Quran.
So bottom line, are Muslims and Islam, by extension, immoral or barbaric?
Absolutely not. When we take the Quran and understand the spirit of the revelation 1400 years ago, and we see the basic teachings of this text, we see that it stands for one of the highest moral and ethical standards that we can find among the sacred scriptures of the past and among the world's great religions.
Thank you for that, Dr. Shabir Ally.
You're welcome.